Hey, and welcome back. What I'm going to tell you today is absolutely fascinating. A recently declassified document from the George Bush Library, document number 500. It's in the form of a CIA briefing to the president. And it clearly shows how the world was closer to nuclear war in 1983 than in any other time. Of course it never happened. But what's fascinating in this document is the miscomprehensions. How both the Soviet Union and the United States did not understand each other. In a bit of a different film today, I'm just going to read a selection of the documents for you. They're in order of how they were presented to the president. And very little of it has been redacted. It's a fascinating snapshot from history. I'm not going to comment on what I read. I'm going to let you, as super smart viewers, interpret and understand what you are hearing. And if you'd like to read the document, over 100 pages, there's a link in the description to the National Security Archive. So sit down and put yourself in the chair of the president in the Oval Office. I will be your CIA briefing officer, and this is what I'm going to tell you. Never, perhaps, in the post-war decades has the situation in the world been as explosive and, hence, more difficult and unfavourable as in the first half of the 1980s. Mikhail Gorbachev, February 1986. Executive Summary. From the late 1970s to the mid-1980s, the military forces and intelligence services of the Soviet Union were redirected in ways that suggested that the Soviet leadership was seriously concerned about the possibility of a sudden strike launched by the United States and its NATO allies. These changes were accompanied by leadership statements, some public, but many made in secret meetings, arguing that the US was seeking strategic superiority in order to be able to launch a nuclear first strike. These actions and statements are often referred to as the period of the war scare. An urgent KGB and some satellite services requirement that gave the highest priority to the gathering of politico-military indicators of US-NATO preparations for a sudden nuclear attack. Establishment of a special warning condition to alert Soviet forces that a surprise enemy strike using weapons of mass destruction was in progress. And the creation of a special KGB unit to manage a computer program, the V-Ryan model, that would objectively measure the correlation of forces and warn when Soviet relative strength had declined to the point where the preemptive Soviet attack might be justified. During the November 1983 NATO Abel Archer nuclear release exercise, the Soviets implemented military and intelligence activities that previously were seen only during actual crises. These included placing Soviet air forces in Germany and Poland on heightened alert. We believe that the Soviets perceived that the correlation of forces had turned against the USSR, that the US was seeking military superiority, and that the chances of the US launching a first nuclear strike. Reporting from a variety of sources, including Oleg Gordievsky, a senior KGB officer who once served as second-in-command in a London residency and who had since defected to Great Britain, taken as a whole strongly indicates that there was in fact a genuine belief among key members of the Soviet leadership that the United States had embarked on a program of achieving decisive military superiority that might prompt a sudden nuclear missile attack on the USSR. The CIA debated three possible scenarios. 1. Soviet leaders had not changed their strategic thinking, but were attempting by means of propaganda and intelligence deceptions to slow the US military buildup, prevent the development of new weapons, and isolate the US from its allies. 2. Soviet leaders may or may not have changed their strategic thinking, but a power struggle among Kremlin factions and the need to deflect blame for poor economic conditions made it useful to exaggerate the military intentions and capabilities of the US. And 3. Soviet leaders have changed their strategic thinking and in fact believed that the US was attempting to gain strategic superiority in order possibly to launch a nuclear-first strike. When analysts attempted to arrive at a single strong conclusion, they not only run the risk of being wrong, but they run 2 additional and perhaps more worrisome risks. They are likely to underestimate the possibility of change. The safest prediction is always that tomorrow will be like today, and they are likely to rely on mirror imaging. Our adversaries think the way we do. In this era of unprecedented breakneck change, the first error grows in importance. And as we cannot know what individuals will next hold power in the USSR or when, it is an especially grave error to assume that since we know that the US is not going to start World War III, the next leaders of the Kremlin will also believe that and act on that belief. As the Carter years wound to a close, America's bilateral relationship with the USSR was on the downswing from the earlier détente. The Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan brought bitter NATO condemnation, and SALT II languished unratified. As the new Republican administration took up the reins, President Reagan announced in his State of the Union speech a major peacetime military buildup. By May 1981, the era of self-doubt, personified by the failed Iran hostage rescue attempt, had ended. United States foreign policy took on a new assertiveness. President Reagan declared that the arms control treaties were no substitute for military preparedness, and characterized the Soviet Union as an evil force, the antithesis of the US. Soviet meddling in Afghanistan, Poland, Central America and elsewhere increasingly proved a constant irritant to the new administration and seemed only to reinforce its get tough posture. In 1983, the Soviet rhetoric had sharpened. Moscow had accused President Reagan and his advisors of madness, extremism and criminality in the conduct of the relations with the USSR. The United States was portrayed as a nation singularly pursuing a first strike nuclear capability as a prelude to eradicating communism. Westerners, including some well-known experts on the Soviet Union, reported alarming conversations with Soviet citizens and officials that indicated a large portion of the Soviet population believed nuclear war was dangerously close. The end of the Vietnam Syndrome and the readiness of Washington to use force once again in the Third World, either by supporting insurgencies against Soviet client regimes, as in Nicaragua, or acting directly, as in Lebanon and Grenada, to foster the peace movement in Western Europe, so as to derail INF deployments and encourage neutrality within NATO, to portray President Reagan as an incompetent warmonger so as to deepen cleavages among nations in the West. At the same time, US analysts often tended to characterize Soviet leadership's decision-making as rational, even omnipotent. United States intelligence clearly did not have sufficient sources to derive a precise picture of the Kremlin's decision-making process, nor did it have a thorough understanding of the aging leadership's strengths and weaknesses. United States analysts nevertheless described Soviet policy as driven by prudent calculation of interest and dogged pursuit of long-term objectives, even in the face of great adversity, rather than by sudden swells of fear or anger. Undeterred by what was termed the Soviet propaganda campaign, and very concerned about the threat by the large number of SS-20 deployments, America continued to firm up her defences by, for example, deploying cruise missiles and Pershings in Europe, adopting a forward-based military strategy, embarking on a path of forced modernisation and improved readiness, and invigorating a strong continuity in government, strategically designed to protect US leadership during a nuclear exchange. Redacted had been tasked with obtaining information on a major NATO exercise, believed to be Abel Archer 83. This order reportedly followed from a high-priority requirement by Moscow a year before to look at any indication of US preparations for a nuclear-first strike. Warsaw Pact leaders reportedly were convinced that the Reagan administration was actively preparing for nuclear war and was capable of launching such an attack. By the fall of 1983, the beat of Soviet war scare drums was almost lost in the cacophony of the international thunderstorm. Massive demonstrations erupted in Germany and other NATO countries to protest the INF deployments. The Soviets shot down KAL-007, the Marine barracks in Beirut was bombed, and the US invaded Grenada. Against this backdrop, NATO held its annual command post exercise to practice nuclear release procedures in early November 1983. This recurring exercise, known as Abel Archer, included NATO forces from Turkey to England. Although past Abel Archer exercises were monitored by Soviet intelligence, the reaction by Warsaw Pact military forces and intelligence services to the 1983 exercise was unprecedented. Air armies in East Germany and Poland were placed on alert. This abnormal Soviet behavior to the annual announced Abel Archer 83 exercise sounded no alarm bells in the US indications and warning system. United States commanders on the scene were not aware of any pronounced superpower tension, and the Soviet activities were not seen in their totality until long after the exercise was over. The British Foreign Ministry, however, was sure that something was amiss. The British ambassador to the US paid a visit to the State Department's Under-Secretary for Political Affairs, Lawrence Eagleburger, to discuss the issue. But according to the responsible briefing official from State Bureau of Intelligence and Research, INR's position at the time, and thus State's position, was that the Soviets were pursuing a massive propaganda campaign. The INR officer presented to Eagleburger a skeptical version of events designed, in his words, to discourage the British. The British case apparently was not helped by the ambassador's presentations. He was not entirely clear about events, and his intelligence aide, most familiar with the war scare, was out of the country. There was even suspicion in some American quarters that the Foreign Office was simply capitalizing on good political occasion to force President Reagan to tone down his rhetoric and delay deployments of the INF missiles. Thus, the Foreign Office's expressions of worry fell on deaf ears. United States analysts categorically concluded, "We believe strongly that Soviet actions are not inspired and Soviet leaders do not perceive a genuine danger of imminent conflict or confrontation with the United States. This judgment is based on the absence of force-wide combat readiness or other war preparation moves in the USSR, and the absence of a tone of fear or belligerence." The Soviet reaction to Abel Archer 83 was dismissed as a counter-exercise, but analysts acknowledged that the elaborate Soviet reaction was somewhat greater than usual. During lengthy debriefing sessions that followed, Gordievsky supplied a fuller report on the Soviet war hysteria. This report, complete with documentation from KGB headquarters entitled KGB Response to Soviet Leadership Concerns over U.S. Nuclear Attack, was first disseminated in a restricted manner within the U.S. intelligence community in October 1985. Gordievsky described the extraordinary KGB collection plan, indicating in 1981 to look for signs that the US would conduct a surprise nuclear attack on the Soviet Union. He identified and reviewed the factors driving leadership fears. Based on the perception that the US was achieving a strategic advantage, those in the Kremlin were said to believe that the US was likely to resort to nuclear weapons much earlier in a crisis than previously expected. They also were concerned that the US might seek to exploit its first strike capability. Other redacted sources supported Gordievsky's reporting. Perhaps the most important redacted information on the war scare became available in the spring of 1987. Redacted a KGB computer model called V-Ryan, meaning Sudden Nuclear Missile Attack, and how it was used as a tool to predict US strategic intentions in the early 1980s. At the same time, this redacted the accompanying pact-wide emphasis on collecting strategic intelligence against the US, including efforts to enhance illegal agent operations to detect US plans for a surprise nuclear attack. Redacted the seemingly improbable but apparently widespread Soviet belief that the US leadership would attack first to a deeply seated Soviet fear of foreign invasion. Redacted CIA's Science and Weapons Daily Review, in which analysts declared, "We believe that the existence of the V-Ryan model is likely." As for the V-Ryan computer model, the authors said, KGB analysts working on the V-Ryan operated under the premise that the United States, when it had decisive overall superiority, might be inclined to launch an attack on the Soviet Union. In light of this assumption, and because the program was supposed to determine, in a quantifiable way, when such a situation might be approaching, they believed it could provide strategic warning when the USSR was in a critically weak position relative to the United States, and conditions therefore were potentially conducive to a US attack. These views reflected a widespread Soviet belief that definitive US superiority over the Soviet Union was inherently unstable. The authors also believed that, redacted, it was possible that the results of the analysis from the V-Ryan computer model themselves were a factor in the air of immediacy surrounding KGB headquarters' concern over the possibility of a US surprise nuclear strike. Strategic Warning System. Before the early 1980s, the Soviet early warning system probably could not provide its leaders with much advance warning of a surprise US nuclear attack, outside the context of a political crisis. Ballistic missile early warning radars, located along the periphery of the Soviet Union, were probably able to give about 13 minutes of warning against US ICBMs and about 5 to 15 minutes against SLBMs. The Soviets apparently came to recognize that they would need much more time to initiate a response. They began several improvements in the late 1970s, including the addition of several new radars. Some high-ranking Soviet military leaders at the time apparently doubted whether the political leadership was up to the task. Marshal Ograkov, chief of the Central Staff in the early 1980s, seemed to question whether the aged and ill Soviet leadership would be willing or able to meet the strategic decision-making responsibilities in times of crisis. This event, codenamed Abel Archer, occurred at a time when some Soviet leaders seemed almost frantic over the threat of war. According to press accounts, Politburo member Gregory Romanov grimly stated in a speech at the Kremlin on the same day that Abel Archer commenced, "The international situation at present is white hot, thoroughly white hot. When the United States and NATO play with fire, as they are now doing, theirs is not simply an irresponsible activity, but an extremely dangerous one. The US NATO military and political leadership must realize that whatever they create and whatever means they elaborate for unleashing an aggressive war and conducting combat operations, the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies will be capable of a fitting response. Well done if you stuck around and you go all the way through to this point. I'd like to say a couple of things. First of all, how terrifying that the world nearly had a thermonuclear confrontation in 1983. So what lessons were learnt from this event? I think two. First of all, the Soviet Union's over-reliance on their V-Ryan computer system to analyze the US intentions. And two, the US intelligence community's reliance on what they do today, they will do tomorrow model, which was obviously wrong in a time of change. So now you've had your briefing. How do you react to knowing that the truth is out there?